Hey guys, welcome back. We've got module number 5 here. It's all about selecting source codes. And this one I think is really good because this is going to speak to a problem that we all have when we're either getting into it or even if we're veterans in the app space or the reskin space. And you're always saying, how do I choose the best product? We deal with this, if you've ever been on like Amazon or Walmart, or you go shopping anywhere, we're all selecting products. But with source code, it's a kind of a next level because it's a digital product and it's not always something that we're familiar with. So this presentation and this video is going to be all about how to pick the right source code. And the goal of this is I want to show you what makes a good source code. So when you guys are going out and you're making your decision, now it can be on my site, it can be on a competitor's site, it doesn't matter. But when you're making these decisions, I want to show you just what to look for. Like what makes it a good source code versus a garbage source code. The second thing we want to talk, I want you to know by the end of this is how to find one. How do you go out? Like, what do you look for? Like, what sort of characteristics are good to find? And the third is just general strategies. Just this idea of like, what's the best practice? What are people deciding on, and what's going to help me be successful in the long term? Now, why is this important? And the first thing, honestly, is because most of us are not programmers. I am not an app programmer. I've built 1,500 apps, and I am not a programmer, right? I can do web programming sort of well, but I definitely cannot code for apps. And 99% of people that get into this business are not hardcore app programmers either. And that's why this is important, because the education is geared towards people that don't have that programming background. The second is most of us don't have any idea what quality is. You get into the reskin space and you're saying, well, I want a source code, but like what exactly is quality code? Like if I'm not a programmer, how do I know? And we're going to talk about that. And the third thing is I don't want you to get burned, and you don't want to get burned. And that's really important because that's how businesses grow and that's how frustration grows. I want you to make sure that you are like in a position of control and power when you make your decision. And this can make a huge difference in your business, not only with the budget, like how much you end up spending, but also in the timeline, how much time you waste or how much time you don't waste. And then finally, of course, frustration, which is one of the hardest things to deal with in business. Now, this decision of buying a source code can be broken down into a few key components. And we're going to run through all of these a little bit more in depth. So the first is just the coding engine. What is it coded in? What type of source code is this? What language is it in? What platforms does it go on? The second is the resource and image count. This means how many design images am I going to have to actually redesign? And another way to put that is how big of a project is this going to be? And that's really important. The third is, do you pick a game, do you pick a utility, and do you pick something else, like an entertainment app or a messaging app or a finance app or a medical app? What do you pick? And we're going to talk about that, why you would choose one or the other. The fourth is individual versus bundle. Do you just buy one or do you buy a bunch at the same time? And there's actually a lot of pros and cons to doing both. And then finally is just how much should you pay? What's a good benchmark to know and think about and say what's a reasonable amount of money I should be paying for this? Okay, so let's start with the development side, and we're going to gear this towards people that have limited or no programming experience. So we're going to go very slow, and I'm going to walk you through this so that it's very easy to understand. So the first thing to think about is, you want to keep it simple, but you also want to keep it mainstream. And the two platforms you're going to see most often are going to be Unity and Cocos 2DX if you're thinking about going cross-platform. Now the other, once you get below this, it's just going to be, all right, well, you're just developing for iOS, which is called native, or you're just developing for Android, which is just Android native code. But these Unity and Cocos 2DX are becoming more popular because it allows you to export to all different platforms, so from one central place. And that's going to make your life a lot easier, right? So when you're deciding what sort of code, realize that when you see things like Unity and Cocos 2DX, you have the ability to export to multiple platforms much more easily than if you just have for iOS or just have for Android or whatever it may be. Now Unity, if you don't know much about Unity, it's a big piece of software and it can export to cross platforms, and not only to Android and iOS. I mean, we're talking like Xbox, PlayStation, Windows, like everything, right? I mean, some of the biggest Xbox games are built on Unity. Now this is designed for 2D and also 3D games. You're going to see a lot of 3D platforms. Unity is kind of the de facto because it's so easy to use and build those models. But it's not it's not always that way. It's pretty easy to code with. I wouldn't say it's necessarily like You'll learn it in a weekend, but they're getting better and better at making it easier to understand. And if you decide to go into Unity, it can be a fun project. I know a lot of people that have a lot good time. There's also a lot of Unity developers out there, and if you need a recommendation, there's going to be a bonus module in the Reskin course. You'll see it where it just says like resources, and we'll put in links to developers, specifically Unity developers, if you ever want to use them. They'll take care of everything. The fourth thing is, it provides really rich quality. The games that come out of Unity are usually really high end, which is awesome. And there's tons of plugins available. You can add on whatever sort of SDKs or networking or gaming or whatever you want into it. Now, Cocos 2DX is like you put it into a native build and then it exports to multiple platforms. So what that means is you'll be using Apple software and it may have Cocos 2DX in there, and you're going to be able to pull that out and export it to whatever platform you want. Now, if you're a developer, that's great. If you don't code and you're not interested in that stuff, don't worry about it. All you need to know is that Cocos 2DX is going to allow you to work in any platform you want, which is awesome. It exports cross-platform, and what Cocos 2DX is it's considered what's called an engine. And what the engine means is that it will do things like create the movement. So let's say Angry Birds, like how the birds fly and what that physics looks like. That's what Cocos 2DX is going to do. It's typically designed for 2D apps, which means it's a flat app, like there's no 3D graphics. So Angry Birds is a good example of what a 2D game looks like. And you can create apps relatively quickly. It's you can use a lot of the frameworks in Cocos 2DX. It's widely understood by developers. So you can really do a pretty quick job with Cocos 2DX. Now, a few others you might see. Corona. We don't sell any Corona on Blue Cloud, but you might see that out there. And then obviously native, which is what I mentioned earlier, where it's just iOS. Objective-C, Swift is also part of the native iOS platform, and then Android. So it's just it's iOS, and if you want to go cross-platform, you need to do the conversion yourself. So what exactly do you pick? You got all these options. And the first thing you do is you say, all right, well, what can my developer handle? Or if you're the developer and you want to be the developer, what can you handle? What do you know about, or what do you want to learn about? So what you do is you would send an email or a message on Odesk or Elance to your developer and say, hey, look, here are the 3 codes I'm thinking about buying. One's in Unity, one's in Cocos 2DX, one's in native iOS. Which one of these can you code in? And then they'll let you know. And that's a good thing versus buying a code, then turning them and saying, hey, I got a Unity code. And they say, well, get lost. I don't know how to do Unity. That's really important. The second thing is ask about the seller, right? What do they specialize in? What do they have? Are they able to handle support for Unity codes? Are they able to handle support for iOS or Android or Corona? If they're selling Corona, do they know Corona really well? So think about that. What does the back end look like? Who built this, and how smart are they in that field? The third thing to think about is leverage, right? Do you want to be able to go to many platforms? And that's not always the case. Often as a beginner, it's not necessarily a good idea to want to go to multiple platforms. It's better to just get one platform really good before you go to multiple. But just think about that and be very honest with yourself about well, where am I? What do I want to do? And the bottom line with the rule of thumb is if you're a beginner, don't get ahead of yourself, right? You could walk in and be like, oh, of course I want to build a huge business, and I want to buy this killer $2,000 Unity code because it's going to I want to be on Xbox and I want to be PlayStation game. It's going to be so cool. But you've never developed an app, right? Don't get ahead of yourself. It's okay if you just want to develop a native iOS app or a native Android app. That's totally fine. So ask yourself these questions, get very specific answers, and that's going to help craft your decision from a development standpoint. All right, so second thing is the resource and image count. What should you look for when you're thinking about this? So the first one is ask for a resource list, and most of the time they're going to provide you with one. At the very least, they're going to give you an image count, and that's really all you need because you're going to be able to understand what it is. You give it to your designer and say, hey, this is going to take us 122 images to reskin. 40 of them are kind of repeatable images, 25 are buttons. How long do you think that's going to take? And they'll be able to say, oh, that's going to be a 10-hour project or that's going to be a 100-hour project. That's really important, just to understand how many images there are. The second thing is just trust your eye's judgment. So the first thing when you're thinking about image count is just download the app and go through it and see how it is. And make a judgment call on how many images are going to be. The third, the 3D resources can be harder and more expensive. That's just a kind of a general term, like general statement. Now, if a Unity code is built for reskinning, and some of the Unity codes we sell, that's exactly why we sell them, is because they're much easier to reskin. But if you just go out to the greater world and you say, all right, I'm going to go buy like a 3D code because it looks awesome, but the code it has 1,000 3D physics models that you need to redo, that's going to be a bigger job than 1,000 2D images. So just keep that in mind when you're looking at projects like that. And one final thing is just watch out for animations. Animations are when they what do you call it, like back in the 50s or whatever, when they would play a ton of images really fast and it would make it look like the character is moving. That's how a lot of animations work in code too. It's just individual images, and it's like flashcards that they spin really fast, and that's just a lot of images to design. So what to look for? I mean, if you can find with less than 100 images, that's going to be a really easy project. That's going to be a really good beginner project, whether it be a game or utility app or whatever else. It's probably going to also be a very small project. It's hard to find low resource count images that will be able to give you a lot of horsepower, but it's going to be an easy project. It's not going to take you more than a couple hours to redesign that app. Image counts can also be duplicates for Retina, iPad, Android. Okay, so let's say they say, all right, well, there's 200 images here. Now that may be very literal, like I counted 200 images in the file list, but in reality, one image may be the Retina image, then maybe the iPad image, the Android image, and the iPhone 6, and the iPhone 8, and the iPhone 4, and that's actually just one image just resized 6 times. So that's something to think about too. Is often these image counts are far less than the total number that you see. And then, like I said, just download the app and see for yourself. It's going to give you the best understanding, and you're just gonna know. You're going to get a good gut feeling about it. So the third thing to think about, all right, what style to pick? So the reason we talk about games and utilities, I'll talk about this in a minute, is just because they're the most popular and that you're typically the most successful for reskinning apps. Now you could do something like entertainment, you could do something like finance or medical or reference or books or music. I mean, anything, right? But we focus on games and utilities with a little bit of entertainment, just because you can hit trends and it can be very popular with entertainment. But the first thing to think about is, like, what's the monetization system? Like, is it ads? Is it in-app purchases? Is it a paid app? Does it have reward walls? Is it a sponsored app? Like, what about this? How does this app making money? Because that's going to be very different for games and utilities on how you make money from the app. Now, the second thing to think about is just how long do people stick around? Like, are there reviews? Always download the app and see how much usage does it look like people are using in this app. The third thing is, how do you make the code evergreen? Now, this is really important for something like an entertainment or utility app, because it's going to be easy to say, like, oh, cool, Instagram's so hot right now. Like, I'm gonna capitalize on this trend. But you also got to think about, well, how do I make this last for a very long time? And that comes down to, well, what kind of updates do I want to do? What kind of themes do I want to pick? And just think about, okay, how is this going to be really cool in a year from now, irregardless of what happens for the reason you picked it? And I think it's really also important just to say, well, which one do you enjoy more? Some people love working on games, and some people like working on tools, utility apps, like photo apps or whatever it may be. And that's an important thing, because that's going to help you stay motivated. One thing to think about too is think about your improvements before you purchase. If you use a lot of photo apps or utility apps and you buy a photo app, typically you're going to have a lot more ideas about how to improve it. Now, similarly, if you play a lot of games or you're really interested in games, you're going to have a lot more ways to improve the source code because you know games. Think about that stuff, or at least go out and do research. Maybe there's a frame app, like how to put like photos in frames. Go out and download 20 frame apps and write down every idea that you see, and then say, like, well, I could do this, I can do this. The same with games. Now, what I like about utilities personally is because they have a very specific audience, and that audience is a problem solution. Right? Like, they're downloading your app because it solves a problem for them. Like, I need an alarm clock that plays music when I wake up. That is a solution to a problem I have. That's what I really like about that. And then you can just listen to reviews and just that's just a feeding of a demand. Games is more about, like, wow, I really like this. I didn't even know this is what I wanted. Now, when you get into casino, it gets into a little bit more of the, hey, I just want, like, this is what I want. Just give it to me and it's all good. But that's something to think about too, is, how do you run businesses? How do you think about updating an app? Is it oh, this would be so cool? Or do you say, all right, this is a problem, I'm going to solve it? The last thing is, all right, if you go do your keywords or you think about what keywords you want to capitalize, think about that before you buy anything. Because if you're looking at keywords and you're saying, like, oh, I could totally capitalize on these keywords and they're much more focused towards games, gaming might be a better source code to buy. But if you find a lot of keywords that have a lot of volume and you say, oh man, this would be awesome for an entertainment app, maybe that's the type of source code you should be buying. So the fourth thing is, okay, individual codes versus a bundle package. This is an awesome one because you're going to see a lot of different choices to make. So the first, like what most people say, like, oh, obviously more is better. Like I'm gonna buy a ton of apps and it's gonna be great. But what I'm telling you is it's not always true. Sometimes that is very true, but not always. And we're gonna explain why. So the first is, like, if you are inexperienced or you're a beginner or you're just getting started or you have a small budget, whatever it may be, just stick with one code. I mean, that's just a really good way to start. It's just like, all right, I'm going to focus on one code. And even if you buy a bundle because it's a good deal, like just focus on one of those codes and just keep the other ones in your bullpen so that when you're ready to work on them, you have them. But just, like focus on one code. If you're experienced, getting bundles is going to help you out a lot. Now, this is not like a, hard stead rule, but you can understand this, right? Like if I was just starting out and I saw like one code or, a pack of like 25 codes, the ability to learn and do really well on one code is going to give you a really good opportunity. Now, as your team and your operations improve, bundles become a great deal because you can start to leverage a lot of what you're working on to the other games. Like not only from an education standpoint, from a resource standpoint, right? Like if you buy one casino app on its own and you build out all this graphics and architecture, typically you can use a lot of that. Like if you develop cards or coins or slot images or whatever, slot machine images, like typically something else in your casino bundle can use a lot of those images. And if you have the operations in place, that can be a very cheap way to do 80% of your work in another app already. So that's something to think about too. And then, that's part of being resourceful and like understanding that. So the bottom line on all this is, like, if you're just starting out, you can buy a bundle, but just focus on one of the codes in there. So maybe you like utilities. It's okay to buy a bundle, but just stick to the utility for them for that period of time and have the other two apps ready for when you learn and you get the operations built out. But don't think like, oh, I gotta develop all three at the same time, or all five, or all 10, or all 55, or whatever you're thinking about. And finally, let's talk about probably the most important question, which is what people ask me a lot, is how much should you even pay for a source code? What is a good price to pay? And I want to be very clear about something. The number one rule, everyone, if you're watching this, do not risk your finances. Okay, like especially if you're just starting out, do not bet the farm on this. Don't go out and be like, oh, I'm gonna take a mortgage out on my house, like I'm going all in. Because it's just like any business. You want to start out small and you want to be very safe about what you're doing so that you can be in control and you know what you're getting yourself into. So I just want to be very clear about that, is that it can be tempting to spend a lot of money. And if you have a lot of money, that's totally fine, and you can spend it. But the last thing I ever want is someone who's like, I only have $500, and they go and they max their credit card out to buy a huge source code and they get themselves into a big hole. So just be very clear about what your budget is. And the second rule that I really always tell people is, start small. It's okay to start small. There's no clock on the wall that's saying you have to go and do something totally epic today. So just start small. Start with a few small apps, and then as you get bigger, as you get smarter, as you get more people on your team, go larger. Because that's going to allow you to manage those processes and the operations. So it's okay to start with a small code and not spend a ton of money, and then know that in 6 months you'll be buying bigger codes. So when you're thinking about how much you should spend on your app, remember that to focus on your plan. Like, the amount of money that you spend on your code is also going to be, well, how much do I spend on my team? How much am I developing? How much am I designing? Like, what does that whole cost look like? And those are things that a lot of people forget about. And often it can be very, very negligible. It can be like, $50 to reskin an app, especially if you help out a lot. But that's something also to think about, is when you're thinking about how much to spend, think about how much can you afford, not only for the code, but also if you're not going to do all the work, how much your developer and your designer are going to cost. So here's some rule of thumb. These are just ballpark figures in terms of actual numbers, right? So if you're a beginner, spend less than $100. Now that can be on one code, it can be on a bundle, it can be anything, but less than $100 is a really good place to start for just the code. Now you might spend $200 on the actual development and design work, and that's okay, but the code itself should be no more than $100 because that's going to give you the education of a lifetime. And it's not just about, oh, I got to make $110 or whatever, $300 if that's your all-in cost. Think about it as like, I am paying $100 to get the ultimate reskin education. And like, it's like going to business school for $100. Like, that's a great education to get. And it's less about, oh, well, this is what's gonna, I'm gonna retire on this. Now the second level, like let's say, okay, you've reskinned a few apps, or you've gone through the process, and you're saying, all right, now I actually want these apps to make me some money. Okay, that's when you start looking at the $100 to $1,000 range. And there's obviously a huge amount. It could be an individual app that's really great, or a bundle of apps within that dollar amount. But no matter what it is, like, this is a good range. And intermediates can be people with a good education. It can be people with a ton of money, because if you have a lot of money and you can just go out and hire a lot of talent, and it can be good to just start in this level. Just say like, well, I've got $30,000. I don't want to just start with these small codes. And the intermediate level is typically a really good place, just because you can still make money on the apps, and you'll also learn a lot. The other thing is, you don't want to miss big opportunities. You also want to be smart. And what I mean by that is, you're going to see things come along and you're going to say, wow, this is a great opportunity. But you also don't buy it because this is just, I can't miss this. Think to yourself, what can I really afford? And when am I really going to be able to use this? And a lot of people, that's really good incentive. If they buy it, they're going to do something to make it happen. So just be smart about that, and don't be afraid to spend money if you know that that's how it's going to be for you. You will walk into an awesome situation. And the other rule of thumb on this is, the bigger the app, the bigger source code, the bigger the return is going to be. So that's why when you start spending more money, you get access to bigger apps, and that typically has better ROI. And then if you're an advanced, with a big budget, or what you're doing and you've got an awesome team, start spending more money. Start spending more than $1,000, because you're going to get bigger apps. And these apps will have not only bigger returns, you're going to have a lot more flexibility. You'll be able to put in more updates, better functionality. You'll get a lot more feedback. The reviews will be more better and more widespread. And it becomes more of a business at that point. And you want to start thinking about spending money on that level. All right, so some final thoughts. I just want to some didn't really fit into any particular bucket, but I thought this was really important for you guys. Do not make decisions purely based on past performance. You're going to see a lot of apps, and not only for my apps, on my website, you'll see a lot of apps, and I say, hey, here's how well it did. I mean, in the case study we talked about with the video merger, I showed you past performance, but realize that I'm not doing that to show you that this is what's going to happen to you. That's not how it really works in business, right? The reason I show you that is to be like, this actually does work in the App Store, and it can work for you. I'm not promising that it will. But what a lot of people, a mistake a lot of people make is that they go out to a marketplace, and the developer will say, oh, this is how much money I made, and this is why you should buy it. I'm saying that is one factor of 15 on why you should buy a source code. And do not put all your eggs in that basket. Similarly, do not judge an app specifically based on if it did not make a lot of money in the past. And a lot of people make that mistake. So just realize that that's only one of many factors that makes a source code successful. Only buy more when you have operations or a plan to hire to support it, right? And this can also be you. What I mean by this is that if you're just starting out and you buy a source code and then you say, okay, now what do I do? That's going to become very tricky for you. It's going to become very frustrating. And what I'm recommending to you is, before you make that decision, or even if just understand that you want to know, that you're going to take the next steps after buying a source code. And that could be, I'm going to go on Elance, I'm going to get Carter's ebooks that walk you step by step through the entire hiring a developer process, and that's the next step you're going to do. Or maybe the next step is, all right, I'm going to spend 1 week and go through this source code, and I'm going to learn how to use Photoshop, and I'm going to do this. Or I have a developer in place, or I'm going to go to a reskin company and I'm going to hire them. No matter what that is, just be very clear with yourself that the second you buy that source code, you know what your next steps are, and you take that next step. Because a lot of people, they don't they don't think about, well, what am I doing like right after I buy the source code? And that's really important to think about. And the third thing is, always improve whatever you buy. I'm a huge believer that you always want to be thinking about, all right, I'm buying like a baseline foundation, right? I'm buying a template, I'm buying the core functionality, but you always want to be improving it. If you really want it to be a successful business, if you want to build that app up, always be thinking about, I'm buying a source code, but this is not the be all end all of my success. This is just the beginning of an app that's going to get really great. And you always want to be thinking about that whenever you buy a source code. And lastly, in business, the return you get often comes from cutting your costs more than driving revenue. So when you're thinking about buying source code, right, like it's really easy to say, well, if I just pile in more into my portfolio, obviously I'm going to make more money. And I'm telling you right now that can happen, but often your return and your profit margins are also going to come from being very smart and like understanding what your operations plan looks like and how much work you're going to do. So when you're thinking about what, like buying a source code, think about, is this a really good fit for the team or the plan that you have in place, as opposed to saying like, well, this code on its own is going to go drive this much revenue and it doesn't matter how much money I spend because it's always going to make more. Like start thinking about, how do I create a really efficient system, and then putting in really smart and good codes in there that you can make better and better and better. So let's do a quick takeaway. When you're buying codes, look at the quality, not the quantity, right? Like that's especially when you're early on, but even as you get bigger, think about codes as, this one's really great code. I don't need 500 yet. Like you may get to that point, but always remember the quality is always gonna do better than quantity, because it's gonna give you the ability to scale up and get good reviews and really make people happy. Have a plan and check your sources before you purchase anything. Always know what your next step is going to be. Always realize that there's going to be a next move, that nothing is going to be completely, all right, I bought a source code, I'm all set, sit on a beach. You want to go be like, all right, I know what I'm doing next. Always realize that buying the source code is one piece of the whole puzzle. Start small and scale up once you have systems and teams in place. This is really important. Don't get ahead of yourself. Kind of take your ego, take a deep breath and say, look, this is not going to happen overnight. I got to be smart about this. I want to start small, and I'm going to fix all the errors I have in my own processes, and then I'll start scaling up and buying more codes. And like I said, know your plan post-purchase. Understand what you want to do with that code. Start thinking about it. You don't have to have it exactly dialed in, but just know that there's work to do once you buy the source code, and that's going to really help you determine which ones to buy. So I hope this was helpful, guys. I had a lot of fun doing this one, and I will see you in the next video.